Hi, I'm Dr. Ann Kellams. I'm a professor of pediatrics and director of the UVA Breastfeeding Medicine program at the University of Virginia School of Medicine in Charlottesville, Virginia in the USA. I'm going to talk for a few minutes about how can you tell if a breastfeeding baby is getting enough to eat. Spoiler alert, we actually have lots of ways, contrary to popular belief. So the myth in this situation is it's really hard to tell if a breastfeeding baby is getting enough to eat. And I've even had colleagues, pediatricians, neonatologists saying, okay, well, let's have the mom pump so we can tell how much the baby's getting. Or since we're not sure how much they're getting at the breast, let's go ahead and feed them the whole 2 ounces or whatever. The reality is we do have a lot of ways to tell. And if we are tracking all of these things, we can be sure that things are progressing safely and as expected. So we're going to talk about that a little bit now. So it's really normal to have very little intake in terms of volume in the first 2 to 3 days. The first graph I'm showing you is from a study that looked at and measured with each and every feeding with pre and post weights, babies who were born by vaginal delivery and by C-section. And you can see that for the 24 hours on day 1, very, very, very small volumes, completely normal. Day 2, little bit higher. Day 3, a little bit higher. Day 4, a little bit higher. And then by day 5, they start to level out. So that's really important for us to understand as care providers managing and supporting a breastfeeding diet. It's also really important for the parents. So the next thing I'm showing you is a chart that we actually have hanging in our postpartum rooms at the University of Virginia that was adapted from the source you see at the bottom with permission. And you can see that it kind of outlines, here's our expectations on day 1, here's our expectations on day 2, and on and on. Baby's stomach is very, very tiny when they're first born, and it gets a little bigger, bigger, bigger. The minimum amounts of urine output that we want to see, at least 1 big stool a day. Babies who are healthy should wake frequently to feed and then be content after the feeding. So it's an expectation talk, and it can be really helpful when you have those worried parents that are expecting because they didn't get any prenatal education and they've not been around somebody who breastfed, that their breasts are going to be full and pouring out ounces of milk on day 1. That would not be normal. Also, another resource is the Newt curves that can be found at www.newbornweight.org. Very helpful tool. This is not the be-all and end-all. This is not the only thing that I would be assessing to know whether or not the baby is getting enough and to know whether or not we need to intervene. But it can be useful, and as pediatricians, we're used to tracking growth curves, and this tracks the amount of percent down they are from their birth weight. So you go to the tool, you put in the date, time, and of their birth and their weight. You put in today's date, time, and their weight. You put in the method of feeding and the mode of birth, vaginal or cesarean section, and it will show you where amongst 100,000 babies or more, where this baby falls in terms of percent weight loss. The way I use it is approximately if they are in the 75th to 95th percentile, meaning they've lost more weight than 75% of the babies born at that same exact age by the hour, basically, then we need to do an evaluation. It doesn't mean we need to start supplementing, nor does 95% mean we need to start supplementing, but it means I want to look. I want to see where we are with milk production. I want to see where we are with effective attachment. I want to observe a feeding and see if there's evidence of milk being transferred. I want to know if mom is starting to feel changes in her breast. So many things go into that. Also, I say beware of 10%ophobia, and that's because it used to be that a long, long time ago, before a lot of labor interventions and IV fluids for mothers, and et cetera, that meant something very different than it does today. And in fact, a number of babies who were born by cesarean section who go on to be perfectly healthy and not dehydrated and not problems with jaundice and not problems with blood sugar, and they lose a little bit more than 10% of their weight, and that's part of their normal trajectory. So have this be a marker for when you need to think about if there's anything going on that's problematic or if we need to do anything, but don't have it be an automatic supplementation. Okay, so here's my checklist for the first couple of days. And I say checklist because, again, just like the Newt curves, there's not one point or one bullet that makes everything okay or makes me worried. It's the picture. It's the entire picture. So there's taking a holistic approach to the situation. So I love to hear that in their history that right after delivery there was skin to skin time and the baby went to the breast. We know that signaling in the first hour or two after birth is what produces the highest possible prolactin spike that's achievable after the baby is born. And so that's a good sign that we started laying down the groundwork and changing the receptors and exposing these hormones to the mom's body in terms of production. I like to know that the baby's meeting the minimum amounts of urine output and stool output. I like to know that there's not nipple pain or compression or trauma, because if there is, then it's likely that we haven't been signaling as well. It's likely that the baby hasn't been getting as much milk out because of compression or obstruction of the little straws that are in the nipple. And that, to me, may be a sign that we need to do something to turn that bus around and get things going more effectively. If you see evidence of colostrum, the little milk mustache on the baby or a little leaking for mom, that's a great sign. But it's not the only thing that I look at. I like to hear that the baby is waking frequently to feed and then is acting content after the feedings, even if that content time is a short time or shorter than they'd like it to be in the middle of the night, for example. But I like to know that they're getting to the breast and that's making them feel better, at least temporarily. I like to see evidence of at least 8 feedings and or signalings, which could be pumping or expression, in 24 hours. Love to hear a history. It's not required, and because some parents don't realize when the baby's swallowing, but it's nice to sort of teach them, or if you see a baby swallowing or hear it, to show them what you're looking for. Because if the nursing staff or the parents are telling me they heard swallows, that's reassuring. If the baby is not consistently latching, then I like to hear that there's been expression or pumping, again, on a very frequent basis. Usually the goal in the first couple of days is at least 8 to 12 times in 24 hours. If the baby's preterm, I'd also like to know that we are augmenting whatever the baby's doing at the breast with some form of expression and then feeding those drops of colostrum to the baby. And that's because some preterm babies come out and they act like big kids and they don't need any help, but you don't know that you have one of those until there's a problem. So it's to try to ward off problems with what we call the great imitators, these preterm babies that get to the breast, they look like they're doing stuff and really no milk is transferring and no signaling is occurring. So I wouldn't necessarily trust a baby that's 36 weeks or less to do this on their own, and keeping in mind that the early term babies, 37 to 39 weeks, may also need some help. As we mentioned, I look at the Newt curves and see where they're plotting on that day. And then, of course, we're doing an exam. And things like dry mucous membranes or loss of skin turgor are late signs of dehydration. So hopefully some of these other things have already given you a clue if you're finding that on exam.